Really honored to have Barb Chamberlain with us. She is the Director of Active Transportation for the state of Washington. We decided that we were going to do something different to let you get to know Barb. And so I would say if you want to read her full bio, please go here or check it out online. But the fun stuff is that we got to ask her a few questions. And so here are her answers. We asked her what her first bicycle was, and she had a purple tassely bike that's right, purple tassely bike that she rode as a young Barb. She originally wanted to be a writer, so we asked her what was it that you wanted to be when you grew up. She said a writer or a marine biologist. What did I miss there? She wanted to be a lawyer, or you could put all of those together. That would be some real powerful stuff right there. And we also asked her what is her favorite bike ride, and she said it's the Centennial Trail in Spokane, Washington. And I think that she has a lot more to share with us. We're honored to have her here with us. And without further ado, Barb Chamberlain.
Thank you for sitting up front. Part of the story I'm going to tell is at one point I taught, and good students sit up front. So I know who you are, you people in the back. And I am the only thing between you and lunch and maybe a great active workshop in the afternoon and the end of the conference. But as Diane said, I wanted to be a writer, so I want to tell you a few stories to go away with. Now, Keith Benjamin is a tough act to bookend. Does everybody agree with that? Yeah. He opened the conference with some really incredibly powerful remarks and talked about the stories of the past, history, her story, their story. And he challenged each one of us to take responsibility and to take action. And I don't know about you, but my brain is fairly full at this point. I've been here all week. Anybody's brain full? Email inbox full? Yeah. And my heart is full from some of the stories that we've heard. So before we leave this little space we carved out in space and time, we came away from normal routines, and we are here together as a learning community, because that's what a conference really is. As well as an opportunity to sell sponsorships and some other things. I have done event planning. But before we go back to those full inboxes, what I would like to do is close our time together by talking about your stories of the future. We opened with the past, let's look ahead. And what is that, his story, her story, their story, that you're going to write with your actions when you leave here? Because we all do that. I believe we are a storytelling species. As Diane said, I wanted to be a writer, so that comes out in all kinds of interesting ways. You got a lot of data here, and for some of you, your job is numbers, but it isn't really the numbers, it's the stories that those numbers tell that you need to communicate. And there is perhaps no better time in history for you to think about what kind of story you're writing with your life. What will you tell people you did years from now when they ask? Because they will ask. We are all going to answer to history. How you tell that story is going to be unique to you. It probably changes for your audience and circumstances. Maybe you just thought of a great punchline and you need to tell the story, so you set up the punchline. If you're from my family, you start to tell the story and then somebody else jumps in to tell you what really happened. Anybody else from that family? Yeah, I am number 5 of 6 kids. So I'm one of the little kids, and the big kids are the ones who get the last word. But not up here. They don't get many microphones. I love that part of my job. So I want to give you an example from storytelling, your life story. So my bike story begins with my purple sparkly bike with the streamers, or the yellow 10-speed that I rode to school. I went to a little country school outside of Lewiston, Idaho. So think county road, irrigation ditches, wheat, maybe alfalfa in rotation. Yellow 10-speed, it had shifters on the down tube. Those are not words I knew at that time. And I felt so free and so powerful, and I rode so far. And not that long ago, I went back to Google Maps and looked it up, and it was 1.5 miles. So one of those short trips, easily converted from car to bike, right? But it was awesome. So that's where my story begins. That's why I'm here today. Or the story begins when some of my neighbors in Post Falls, when I was living in a little suburban subdivision-y kind of place with no sidewalks, did not want a trail to come through the neighborhood because it was going to go by a school, an elementary school listed in the phone book on a street, so everybody kind of knew where the school was, but they saw security threats there, and I thought the trail was a great idea, so I volunteered for the North Idaho Centennial Trail Committee. So that's where my story starts. Or, this one's dangerous. This story starts when I went to a women's political conference in Boise, Idaho in 1990, and I mentioned to somebody that I wanted to run for office. So be careful what you say, because you are at a conference. Somebody may be listening. Quick sidebar on that story. I was born on Election Day. In 1990, I was elected on my birthday to the Idaho State Legislature. And Dianna and I were talking about it. This year, my birthday is Election Day again, and I would like some really good presents. So that's on y'all. Or you could say that this story about why I'm here and why I do what I do begins much earlier with my parents. They grew up very poor during the Depression. My father worked really hard, never went to college. My mom was a teacher because she went to what was called a normal school. It was a 2-year teaching college. And what they told me was I was a really lucky kid. I had a lot of advantages. And they were clear enough, and which is what is interesting to me now, is they recognized that those were unearned advantages on my part. I had done nothing special. And I was really lucky. And because I was so lucky, and because other people would not be as lucky as I was, that I basically owed something. I had an obligation. If the phrase "pay it forward" had been in circulation, my mom would have used it. So that's where my story starts. Or the story starts when the city of Spokane put a bike lane in front of my house and I became Bike to Work Barb in my community. So that is the name of my personal blog. If you love alliteration, let me just say it can go too far. That one's an infrastructure story, right? So the great thing is each of these is true. Each of these starts with one piece and brings me to where I am today. Now, my husband and I have been doing a lot of jigsaw puzzles recently, 1,000-piece puzzles. Any jigsaw puzzle? Yes, just finished a big one right before I left. Of course, it's a picture of a bike. It was really complicated, lots of stripes of different colors, but sort of like a street grid, that was helpful. But you don't really know where you're going with the story of your life. It's not a jigsaw puzzle with a box with a convenient picture on the front. Your individual actions are going to add up to create your story. And of course, each of us has one, probably more than one. Depends on who you're talking to and whether mom's in the room. So that story begins here, or over there, over there, over there, depending on how you choose to tell it. So my question for you is, what's your story going to be? You're all going to be writers now. So depending on which sessions you attended, you should have a lot of ideas. How many people will be going away with an idea you had not already thought of? Super. So that's going to shape the next chapter. It's going to be different. You came to Portland in 2018. Someday you're going to tell a story that starts, I went to this conference and then, because I can tell you genuinely, I went to a conference in Boise, Idaho in 1990 and it changed my life. Because saying to somebody, I want to run for office someday, became later that same year. So maybe you came thinking you're in the business of operating a bike share. That could be pretty reasonable as an assumption coming in. And now you realize you're in the business of individual freedom and justice and equity. And not just transportation equity, but genuine all-in equity, which is going to mean change. I just have to assume you cannot leave here thinking that everything you're doing is perfect as it is. If you raise your hand at this point, we're just going to talk afterwards. But you're going to change how. It needs to be deliberate and mindful and purposeful. You're going to change the way you do business, who you do business with. Remember Keith's story about changing their contracting practices. Who and how you recruit and promote and market, who you see as your customer, what services you provide, what you're going to do with their data when you collect it. You got a lot of information on that here, and you need to be deliberate and mindful and purposeful with what you take away from all of those. So maybe you came thinking you're in the business of community organizing, which has a very proud history, and now you realize you're in the business of congestion relief and partnering with transit and mode shift and infrastructure, sexy stuff like that. Wherever you came from, you should have at least some new story elements because you came to Portland in 2018. In yesterday's plenary, somebody used that classic phrase about speaking truth to power. Now, I get to stand here partly because I have some position power, which I have come to at this point in my life, and a lot of you in the room hold something like that. So I want to say that what you need to do is give your power to truth. That's going to change your story. A little illustration of something I'm able to do from where I am within WashDOT. There are only so many division directors, so I get to be in certain meetings and in certain places. And when I started, part of what I needed to do was lay out the case for active transportation investments. Now, I have great leadership. This comes from the top. This is not all on Barb, but I do have a fair amount of responsibility. I'm going to be talking to a lot of engineers. Engineers want to be bold and raise your hand. You're not hand-raising people. I know that, but okay. Who did a great presentation. But I'm pretty sure they were not going to the same conference as I had been going to. So I talked about data. It was awesome. Told stories about necessity riders, necessity walkers. We heard a lot about of those people in some of our sessions. Those people are our people, the people who have to get to and from work, or the day labor site, or a grocery store, a daycare, or the library that has free internet for a job search because they do not have a smartphone and a data plan. Those people are my neighbors. I live in a neighborhood that has transit service, runs every 15 to 20 minutes during the peak, and then it goes to 30 minutes, and then it goes to 60 minutes. And right after midnight, it stops. And it picks up again at 5:30 in the morning. And there are shifts that end during that gap in service. And not all my neighbors have a reliable car or a car at all. So those are my people that I work for, and those are the stories that I was telling to my engineering counterparts. And in every presentation, I was saying, we need a transportation system that works for everyone, by which I would mean everyone. And here are these folks. And my only number in this session is that 22% of the people in Washington do not hold a driver's license. Now, they may be too young, too old, they may have a legal barrier, they may have a disability that doesn't allow them to drive, there's some reason. And some people are holding a driver's license, but they're not driving, they've got it for ID purposes. So the number of total not driving people might be actually higher. I don't have numbers for that, so I only use the ones that are solid. And none of this is new information. This has been there in the numbers all along. But nobody had been telling that story that way. So I can't tell you how many people said, really? I never thought of it that way. I'm like, okay, I guess I'm a genius. I really hadn't thought it was that tough. It's like calculating a ratio. I majored in English and linguistics, but I can calculate a ratio. It's okay. I am also quite sure that they carry, even the ones who rode bikes, carry a lot of stereotypes in their heads about who bikes. Right? And we all know what that person looks like. You definitely should be coming away from this with data that tells you that that's wrong. Those stereotypes are wrong. And it is your job to go away and normalize bicycling for all, authentic images and stories and realities of bicycling for all, meaning all kinds of riders for all kinds of reasons. That's giving power to truth. I said you need to think about what kind of story you're telling with your life. You may have that all figured out. You might be natural storytellers, or you might not have thought of it in quite those terms. So I'm going to share another story from my legislative days. So I ran for office in 1990, was not supposed to win. One other number, I do remember how many votes I won by. In my first election, out of over 20,000 cast, I won by 313 votes. So I don't know how many doors I knocked on, but it was more than 313. By the way, when I was running for office, one more little story, the week they called me to recruit me to run, they only called me because they needed somebody to at least file for office, if not actually run for it. They needed a placeholder. And I had made this stupid comment at this conference. And so I thought about it, and it's very flattering to be asked, let me tell you. And talked to my husband, and we were not sure, and they called again, and I said, well, let me tell you why I'm hesitating. We've been talking about starting our family, and this week I've been waking up every morning, and I feel just a little bit queasy. And they said, oh, there's this long pause. And I will tell you, this defines my position on a political issue, and I usually try not to do that in a big group, but I will tell you, they were recruiting me to run as a pro-choice candidate. And so after the long pause, they said, but a pregnant pro-choice candidate would be awesome. I'm like, yeah, I get that. Yeah. And I ended up saying yes, I would run. So I filed the paperwork, which is a big scramble to do that, and then the next morning, that little test strip, oh yeah. So yes, I ran as a pregnant pro-choice candidate. Elected on my birthday, and 6 days later had my daughter. So we like to call that a big week. So I took a baby to the legislature, which is not as common a thing. I mean, even today, it still is making headlines, right? And I made headlines. And I loved that job. And I worked on issues like daycare licensing standards, which were pretty personal. I was good at it. I formed coalitions. I was a member of the minority party, and I actually could get enough votes to get a bill passed. That used to happen. And I ran for a Senate seat, an open seat, and I won that. And I was supposed to be a safe seat when I ran for re-election to that Senate seat. In fact, the man who was running for governor wanted to campaign with me because I was in my district. I was supposed to have skirt tails. This is a thing instead of coat tails. And I wanted to run for office in the first place because I wanted to save the world, because somebody has to. And then I lost. So, yeah. After I cried, which I did do, I looked around for what I was going to do next. And I had a friend who was a poli-sci instructor at North Idaho College, which is a community college. Are there any faculty still in the room? Tolu, you might be faculty. Because if there are any faculty, you have to just go like this at this next part. Because there was a person going out on sabbatical who taught prehistory to the Middle Ages, and they needed an adjunct for just a semester. Didn't have my master's, didn't major in history, I minored in it. I had taught some community interest workshop-y kind of things, and he had a file cabinet full of the syllabus and the tests and everything. And I had majored in English and linguistics, and a lot of the story of language and how we come to use words. That's actually prehistory. So I had like the first 2 weeks of the syllabus under my belt. So I got the job. I was probably equally qualified for the legislative position, to be honest. So there's that. I have never studied so hard as when I was a teacher. I was just scrambling ahead of those students. I was exhausted, and I loved it. So then the semester ended, and I had a little time to reflect. Still had that baby. And I had to stop and think, now what's going on? So my first kind of real job after college, I worked for a regional publishing company, and we put out the official centennial books for the state of Washington, and I loved that job. And then I ran for office, and I was in the legislature, and I loved that job. And then I was a teacher for a little while, and I loved that job. I start to sound like somebody who has sort of a spotty work history here. I loved all these things, so what's going on? I mean, am I just that much of a kind of a pinball? Every chapter, if this is a book I'm writing, this is not really a novel, this is more like a short story collection. And so I realized if I sat down and thought about it, what is the common theme? What's the plot to this story? And it's that I need to be doing something I believe in passionately, and I need to communicate about that. I need to try to get you to care as much as I do, with perhaps mixed success in the classroom. And I need to get you to act. You're going to buy that book, or you're going to write that paper, you're going to vote for me, you're going to vote for my bill. You're going to do something because I have told you stories. Haha, that's what's happening at this conference. So with that figured out, my story started to make a little more sense, and I didn't really know my life was a story I was telling until I tried to explain it to myself, and I realized it didn't have that much of a plot unless I really looked for it. So that's why I'm asking you to think about what your story is. How are you going to tell it? What's the plot here? And what's the plot twist or the evolution that's you're coming away with, that you have because you're here in Portland, that you have a change in perspective. You look back and you say, oh, that's where I was going. Didn't quite know that, but something's going to be different. And it may not be crystal clear for you right now, but it may come clear. I used to tell people if I was on a career path, it was kind of like the path you make when you wander into the woods and you say, oh, there's some flowers over there. And I hear a stream and I love running water, and that's a really pretty tree. I'm gonna stop and I'm gonna listen for birds. And then you walk and, oh my God, that's a big hill in front of me, but I can't see a way around it, so I have to go over it. And you get to the top of the hill and you look back and you say, oh, look how far I've come. Who knew? This might also be a plug for better signage and wayfinding. And especially, you may not want people to take the exact sort of wandery path. Somebody used the phrase desire line in talking about how people decide where to go. But if you want them heading the same general direction, you need to put up some signs. So someday, years from now, when somebody asks you, what did you do back in the old days? These are the old days for us. In the scary times before we finally figured it all out and we fixed things. What did you do? Because we do need to fix things. So what are you going to be able to say you did? What's in your story? What is your story about what you did for justice, or for equity, for opportunity and accessibility, for cities, for people, for the planet, for the air we breathe? You are writing that story right now. And I'm glad you're part of the story collective here. There's another story element that got some mention in some of the data and some of the discussion, but I think it's something I would challenge you to start thinking about, and maybe it even becomes a piece of the conference for next year. And this will be more relevant at a shorter time frame for some of you than for others, let me say. If you're an author and you're outlining a novel, it's going to come to an end. There are some final chapters. So what's the story your future self is going to be living in? Anybody read the book Inkheart? I'm kind of a fantasy fan, because that's a book that they're writing as they're living it. Yes, it is a great story. If you're a movie fan, maybe it's The Truman Show. So, you're going to design the set and you're going to put some characters in place, something like that. I was also trying to decide for the Trekkies in the room if this is the Darmok episode with communicating through allegory. I did major in English, just had to use the word allegory. How often do you get to do that? But someday, spoiler, you're going to be old. In fact, right now, a whole bunch of people are turning old every single day. So in my agency, we talk about the silver tsunami. Anybody heard that one? You're not all silver here, so it may not come up quite as often, but every public agency in particular is looking at this huge wave of retirements. And for us, this is a workforce problem. How are we going to recruit and retain people? Because we are in competition with shiny venture capital-backed enterprises. So that's one part of our problem, but the other part of the problem is that's a whole bunch of people whose transportation needs and capabilities are going to change. And not necessarily to make it easier. And they are all used to this level of transportation independence that's pretty geared around having a personal vehicle. And not all of them have one, but a lot. So when they have to stop driving, just imagine what that's going to mean for them and the people around them. So again, you might not be thinking about it now, but I will tell you one more little story about my family. My dad was a World War II bomber pilot. He kept driving well into his 90s. And his hearing was gone, his sight was going, stop signs, kind of just a suggestion, a nice idea for other people. If you lived in Lewiston, Idaho, I told people if you see a Honda station wagon coming and it has gold flake paint and there are a lot of scrapes down the side, you just need to run. Because he doesn't see you and he's not stopping for you. And it took us a long time to get the keys away from Dad. How many people have actually gone through this? Okay, the rest of you have so much to look forward to. Remember, World War II bomber pilot, not easily told what to do. He was the oldest of 7 kids who lived to adulthood. That is the way he always said it. Out of 11 or 13 born, it's a little fuzzy, there weren't actually that great of records. And they had a hard life. And he worked his way up from sweeping the floor at the lumber mill to managing the lumber mill. So you can imagine that his car is a symbol of everything he's accomplished with his life, and we want to take it away. Great. And the thing is, he had no other transportation frame of reference. I mean, I'm pretty sure you don't get back into a B-24 or 17, whichever it was that he flew, to get yourself around Lewiston, Idaho. And he didn't want to take transit. He wasn't going to ride a bike. He was not going to be a passenger in a car driven by somebody else, for darn sure. Like my mother didn't drive when they went places together. We tried it. This is before Uber or Lyft, so we gave a cabbie a deposit, big fat deposit, and gave his business card to Dad and said, look, Dad, you have a personal driver. You can call somebody and they'll drive you places. This may sound familiar. This may even be, a monetizable idea. That is the easiest $200 that cabbie ever made because Dad never called him. Heck of a tip. So when he had to give up his driver's license, he was not going to go anyplace in the van for the old people. They were in assisted living because my mom had dementia, and so my sister had to drive him everywhere. That wasn't transportation independence either, by the way. I am not going to be my dad. How many of you want to be that person with zero transportation independence? Yeah, I didn't think so. I've already told my kids I will only live in a place that has two things, great transit service and great bike infrastructure, period. And that is not just because maybe someday I'm going to get old, it's because there's a demographic category that any one of you can join today. And that is the category of people with disabilities. And you don't always see that one coming. So I've described it as the final chapters of your book, but it could be the next chapter in your story. And so I want you to think about that. That's not necessarily shiny and cool, but that is an emerging and enormous need that our society has to figure out, and you can be part of that solution. I didn't get to go on the part of the tour to see Adaptive Bike Town. I'm looking at Brianna. I really wish I had. I think that is a fabulous idea. I think that we can all commit to saying that when we say bicycling's for everybody, we mean everybody, and there's a way to make that happen. So think of your story. You are creating the transportation system for your future self, and you don't quite know when the future starts. So write that outline with your work. Now here is the genie in the magic lamp part of my story, and we're coming to an end. You're doing things that don't just change your story, you're changing the story in other people's lives with what you do. And you probably already kind of have a sense of that. I mean, you're providing transportation, right? Except that's not all you're doing. You're connecting people to the moments in their lives that matter to them. So think about what they're going to be able to do because of what you do, whose story you're changing, and think about whose story you are not changing with what you do. Like I tell that bike lane story. I used to tell that bike lane story about I started biking to work because they rode a bike, build a bike lane, and bike to work Barb. I really came to understand that is not an infrastructure story. That is a story that embodies a lot of the privilege in my life. The very fact that the city was putting a bike lane in front of the house in the neighborhood where I lived is a piece of that. That I already owned a bike. I could afford to replace it when it got stolen, which happened, unfortunately, twice. I worked the kind of job where if I was late to work, I wasn't going to get fired. I only worked one job. I pretty much had nothing to fear if I had a law enforcement encounter. In fact, I had never thought about that at that point in my life because I hadn't had to. So that's the thing about my story that I didn't know at the time. There's a bike lane. I'm going to start riding to work. How far is it? I will drive my car to find out how many miles that is, which I did. Really, really embarrassing now, but I tell that just to put it out there. And I didn't start biking to work every single day, but the infrastructure was definitely an invitation. You're in the business of invitations. The bike lane was a visual symbol to me that people bike here. Every Bikeshare bike that's out there is a visual invitation saying you could ride a bike. So think what you're doing. You're changing somebody else's story. That bike lane, just like going to the conference in Boise in 1990, that bike lane also changed my life because it put me on a path to being an active volunteer. You can't ride a bike and not be an advocate for better infrastructure. You just can't. And at least not in Spokane. Sorry, Spokane. It's much better now. So it led to a lot of things, including a change in my career and where I live. And it is, again, why I'm standing here today. It's a piece of that jigsaw puzzle. Now, in all of transportation work that I touch, planning and modeling and traffic operations and performance measures and words that go at the top of official reports, we're always talking about big data. Oh, how many of you have a different visual in your mind now when I say big data? Okay. Some of you were there were people in a presentation who know what I mean when I say big data, and it's a lot funnier than it usually is. But we need to get X number of wheeled devices through Y intersection in Z amount of time, or everything's going to go to pot. And that is why I ride a bike, by the way. It's the flexibility to move over to the sidewalk and get out of that. But as far as any individual human being is concerned, they're an N of 1. And when that statistic happens, and we all know there's odds and independent variables and whatnot, it had a 100% chance of happening. It must, because it happened to them. So that's their statistical calculation. I said we're storytelling species. We're not very numerate. We're not really all that great with numbers, some of us. So if something does or doesn't happen for one of us, that N of 1 is all that matters. And that's what you're doing as you affect one customer's life or one person's life, is you're changing their N of 1 experience. And I said earlier that individual actions add up in your story, but it's also true that individual actions and stories add up to collective actions and stories. So one person riding a bike is just great for that person. And probably everybody here has a personal testimonial on that. 5 or 10 people riding a bike, that's a party. That's a good time. I would ride with them if I saw them going by. A whole neighborhood riding, or a city with more and more people riding, that makes our air and water cleaner. And it does it for everybody, not just for the ones who are riding the bikes. But that big story, the big data, can't happen unless that first personal story happens, that N of 1. So that's what you're doing. You're writing your own story, and you're writing or changing the stories of other people. So I want to bring this to a close, this chapter, and I'll give you a recap of some of the things that I said that I hope you take away and kind of work into your story going forward. You make deliberate, mindful, purposeful actions and decisions to shape your story into one that you're going to be proud of years from now. And that is not a small thing. You give your power to truth. You tell the stories that demonstrate that bicycling genuinely is for everyone, and you work to make that true. You connect people with the moments in their lives that matter. You recognize that your own story may look different from somebody else's perspective, and you learn from that. You work to remember that, because once you know it, you can't unknow it, but if you embody a lot of privilege, it can be easy to kind of lose track. So don't do that. This is the outline of the chapters that your future self is going to live in, and the future starts now. And you change somebody else's story for the better with what you do. And when you're writing this story, you are inspiring others to share it. So if what you were really hoping for was something like marketing secret sauce or something, you could also think, oh, this would scale really well. You know, we get people to tell stories, and they share it, it goes viral. But your individual actions and stories really do become collective actions and stories, and together we really do save the world. And that's why I got into this in the first place, right? We also save each other. So let's go out there and write some history, her story, their story, together. Thank you.
So Barb is generously offering to do some Q&A if you have some for her.
I have baby stories. Yes.
So, for your role at Launch, can you speak to maybe some of the major change that, say, introduced to the RRPAT to say, that others may want to latch onto or
Yeah. Well, I mentioned position power. I will say organizational structure really is a signal, both internally and externally. There are not many DOTs that have a position equivalent to mine. They have a state bike ped coordinator because federal highways requires you to have one. But they don't have my title, and they aren't in the meetings that I'm in, frankly. And so I don't actually have to say it every time. I'm sitting there, again, I'm like a bike lane, I guess. I'm sitting there and they look at me and they think, oh, right. The head of our design division was in a meeting, a big meeting with somebody presenting about something was going to be better for traffic, and he looked at me, and then he raised his hand and said, "Hey, when you say traffic, do you really just mean cars?" I'm like, yes, yes. So being present is in and of itself a change. I also have the chance to touch a lot of documents and sort of processes to say, let's look at this through a multimodal lens. And when you say traffic, do you really mean cars? And if you mean cars, just say you mean cars, name it and own it. And then say, but what about all those other people? So I would say that organizational structure thing alone is really big. And it's not just DOTs that don't have this. I was at our public transportation conference, and somebody noted on Twitter that there aren't that many transit agencies represented here, and you'd like to see more. At our public transportation conference, we did have a couple of bike-related sessions. I submitted those. But in that conversation, the person who is the bike coordinator for Sound Transit, which is our regional transit agency in the Puget Sound, was presenting, there's a new bike and transit guide you might want to know about from the American Public Transportation Association. And she said, how many of you have in your agency somebody with a bike coordinator? That's part of their job. Not a hand in the room went up. So that was another topic that came up here, is that this all needs to connect to transit, and the systems that are robustly connected to transit can see that in the data. So having a person with the job title that says you have that responsibility at whatever level in the organization really matters. Dianna.
You know, your story about your dad sparked something. Can you talk a little bit about it? So it's one thing for the transportation piece, but I also think that there is a vacuum that transportation exists in, the transportation conversation exists in, where we're not also talking to the developers that are putting in the grocery stores and the things that your dad might need to get to that make that more of a strain on our transportation system.
Yeah. And housing.
Yes.
And where we put senior housing or those kinds of facilities in particular, it's often on cheap land. Cheap land does not have good connectivity. And that's another piece of what I've been saying to our regional offices. I will say, again, I'm trying to get people who have position power to just use your power for good, not evil. It's a good thing. And our regional administrators are the heads of those, a pretty large swath of land. And they're often on other kind of community boards and regional and metropolitan planning organization board, that kind of thing. And we don't do land use decisions in the state of Washington as the DOT. We live with the results of land use decisions. But I want them asking those questions. And that too comes from the top. Roger Millar, who's our Secretary of Transportation, was at Smart Growth America before, and he walks to work. So, oh, by the way, he walks the talk. I am looking for a really good bike equivalent that rhymes. Remember, I'm a word person, but sidebar there. But after I had this conversation with one of our regional administrators, I said, do you know the data for your county that the headquarters is in, what's happening with average age? And he said, oh, lots of people retiring here. They love it. It's dry, it's hot, whatever. Good for old bones, I guess. And I'm not quite there. And so as we were driving away, I said, so when those people have to stop driving, then what? And he said, I don't think we're having that conversation as a community. And I said, you know what? Paratransit is the most expensive transit service. I mean, adaptive bike share is going to cost more than regular bike share. And we drove away, and we went down this highway, and up on this hill, like if you were from Switzerland, you wouldn't want to walk or bike up and down this hill. It was really steep, and there is a senior community, and that's all that's up there. Like surrounded by dry desert. I'm not planning to retire to Yakima, sorry, Yakima. But there's nothing there. Not a library, not a grocery store, not a doctor's office, or a dentist office, or where to get your dentures fixed, anything. So everybody who went in and out of that place had to go by vehicle. So yeah, I don't have answers, but we really need to be in those conversations. One of the things I've said to people too, in one of the sessions we were in, one of the table topics is, instead of going in with our thing is the answer, you go in and you say, what are your questions? What are you trying to figure out? And then you listen for where bikes could be part of the answer. My means to your end. And I think that same conversation around affordable housing and so many other things is just critical. We're going to drown in this problem.
Yes, from a complete streets ordinance perspective, Birmingham just recently passed theirs. I was in Nashville before that. We passed one in 2010. The thing that kind of is a head scratcher for me is how does the state work with the local city level about streets, local streets versus state streets that impact the neighborhood? That when it's a great paving project, oh, that's a state street, we can't really talk about that one, but it impacts our neighborhood. How does that work from a state level to a local level, and is there any collaboration on your end that you've dealt with to make sure everything works synergistically?
I will say we're working towards that. I actually have to now search my documents for the number of times I use the phrase gap or barrier, and that phrase is being used to describe a highway. And so what I am focused on, we're about to update our state active transportation plan. I think we're probably signing the contract next week. And we are talking about network analysis and having a methodology that would say, what is the network? And the network starts with the local plan. If you have MPOs, there's a regional plan, maybe. Not every corner of my state has a robust regional active transportation network plan by any means, and not all the towns do either. But where they do have them, and we've got the stuff that comes through the middle and creates the gap and the barrier, we need to be able to actually see that, and that's not something that's called out. A highway plan is a car plan. That's all it is. And so calling that out and saying, where is it that we need greater permeability? Where do we need more crossings? Where is it that the highway comes into a space that makes it a main street? So when we use the phrase Main Street Highway. And every state probably does this differently. We've got some agreements with our communities of certain population size and above. We've got curb to curb, they've got curb and out. And so we do still need to have that conversation about what curb to curb, what street channelization do you want? Do you want bike lanes? And we need to be part of executing on your plan when we come through with our next paver. And that does take a lot of time and conversation. Time for conversation is not something DOTs are very well resourced for. All our money is tied to project delivery, and project delivery means off-ramps, and those are hard to cross if you're on foot. So I would say I think we have a long way to go. I think we are sincerely working toward it and using those principles of network analysis. We want to be able to say this is where the network really needs to be whole, and we own that piece of it that is critical. And we are not doing it right everywhere. I know I talked with somebody here about one of the projects that's not doing that. So I'm talking about an ideal state that we want to work towards. And I also think a lot of places, if you ask them about their bike plan and said, so did you think about the network? That might not even be the word they applied to it. They might have put it down where it's easy. Arterials are wide, so you stripe some stuff there. So that, and then talking about stress level analysis, is this a comfortable network for all ages and abilities? And again, that's not highway engineer speak. So working on it, and I am happy to share anything, by the way. I'm very findable on Twitter, but also just online, or I don't know if my email's in the bio, but happy to give you a card and send you what we come up with, both the scope of work around our state plan update, and then as things emerge out of that. Great question. Anybody else, or are y'all just really hungry for lunch? All right. Thank you. This has been, I want to say to the organizers, thank you so much. This conference has far exceeded my expectations. I will say I've never been to a Bikeshare conference before. I have colleagues saying, can you bring some of those panels to our bike summit or to something else? Can they do webinars? This has been really phenomenal, so I hope you all appreciate this space and time in which you changed your stories.
So thanks again to Barb for an insightful, humorous, inspiring closing plenary. So thanks again for that. And a few last words of thanks as well. I have plenty of people to thank. Our presenting sponsor, Jump, our platinum sponsor, Lyft, our gold sponsors, Motivate and Free to Move, our silver sponsors, PBSC, Ride Report, and all the other sponsors that made this conference possible. Huge from the bottom of my heart, big thanks to the Better Bikeshare Partnership for being the best partners that NAPSA could ever have. The Bike Town team was also incredible, supplying us with the bikes. And of course, the Portland Bureau of Transportation, thank you for being amazing hosts. And then last but certainly not least, all of you for coming to this conference and making it something that we can have because we have attendees. So thank you so much for coming, and especially for you guys in the room here sticking it out to the end. And I look forward to seeing you all next year.